The first characteristic of news we're going to discuss is timeliness. Basically, what's newer is more newsworthy than what's older. So if something happened today or yesterday, it's going to be more newsworthy than something that happened a few days ago. If it's an ongoing story, something like you're covering a trial that's been going on for 2 weeks, you want to stress what happened today, what are the newest developments, and you don't want to go chronologically and start at the beginning of the trial and then get to what happened today at the end of the story. If you need background information, you want to include it only when it's needed in the story and keep it to a minimum. The next characteristic of news we're going to discuss is impact or magnitude. Journalists basically look at stories that are important or that affect a large number of people. A story like a nuclear agreement with Iran might not be the sexiest story, but it's something that people probably ought to know about. In a story about a plane crash, if it kills 180 people, it's going to be more newsworthy than one that kills 2 people, just because of the number of people involved. The next characteristic of news is prominence. If a story involves prominent people, it becomes more newsworthy. In fact, sometimes stories that otherwise wouldn't be stories become stories because prominent people are involved. Proximity is our next characteristic of news. Basically, people care about what's going on close to home. Stories along the lines of house fires and homicides and those sorts of things generally are newsworthy only in their own community. Proximity doesn't always have to be physical, though. Sometimes it's psychological. College students might be interested about something going on a campus across the country, even though they don't know anyone there, just because that's their group. If you're a college student, you probably care about what's going on with college students elsewhere. If a story is unusual or odd in some way, that can make it more newsworthy. You're never going to see a story that says plane lands at airport successfully because that's what's supposed to happen. It only becomes a story if it doesn't land successfully. You also want to be on the lookout for the unusual and otherwise common stories. For instance, a house fire that doesn't injure anyone is not going to be much of a story on its own. However, if it turns out that it was an arson set by a member of a church because he wanted to punish some of the other members of his church because he felt they were sinners, that makes it a lot more newsworthy. Conflict or controversy can also make a story more newsworthy. If everyone's agreeing on everything, there's no tension and probably not much interest. If you've ever been to a city council meeting or a school board meeting or a student government meeting, most of the time they're very agreeable and there's not a whole lot going on. However, if they're dealing with some sort of controversial topic, you'll have a whole bunch of people show up, they might be loud and angry, and it's going to be a much more newsworthy story. One other thing we do is sometimes we look for humor stories and try to have some fun with them. In fact, we'll have the chance to write a Bright this semester that gives you a chance to be a little bit more creative than the other stories we do. Also, too, keep in mind that reporters cover everything from very basic, straightforward events to investigating complex issues, so people know what's going on in their community and the issues that affect people. There are 2 types of news, and the vast majority of stories fall very neatly into one of the categories. There's hard news and soft news. For hard news, you're dealing with serious and timely stories about important topics. Crimes, the goings on of government, accidents, fires, those sorts of things are all hard news. Soft news is more along the lines of a feature or a human interest story, and the idea behind these is that they entertain as they inform. News stories are supposed to be objective. As journalists, we gather information and report it as factually as we possibly can, and we keep our opinions out of it. It's not our job to comment, interpret, or evaluate. You can point out inconsistencies or inaccuracies in what people have told you, but we don't need to call them liars. Editors will typically leave out offensive details in stories unless there's a compelling reason to leave it in. The thought behind that is that news writing typically has a very broad audience, and we don't need to be offending people for no reason. Editors also tend to avoid sensationalism, but not necessarily sensational stories. Also, rumors themselves are typically not stories. However, as an editor, you want to investigate the rumor, find out if there's anything there, and if there is, then you have a story. The vast majority of news organizations do not identify victims of sexual assault, even if they have the information and it's legal to reveal it. The reason for this is that journalists believe that it might keep other people from reporting rapes and other sexual crimes. Juveniles accused of crimes are also typically not identified unless they're tried as adults. Also, we tend to avoid trade names. It's better to say someone's using a tissue instead of a Kleenex, or having a soft drink instead of a Coke or a Pepsi. However, you don't want to force it. Sometimes there's no alternative. For example, if someone's having a popsicle, what do you call it? And that's a brand name, but you could still use it. Also, if someone's driving a Jeep off-road and it's actually a Jeep, you don't need to call it a small truck-type four-wheel drive vehicle. Just call it a Jeep. It's important to be accurate with information because mistakes hurt our reputations. If we get a reputation of having too many mistakes, people are going to go somewhere else for their news. Carelessness and laziness cause most factual errors, so if you ever have any doubt, consult sources, look things up, basically do whatever you need to do to make sure you get the information right. You want to be on the lookout for internal consistency. If you're saying 10 people were interviewed, it needs to add up to 10. Also, things like saying a serving of Burger King fries contains 480 grams of salt should jump out at you as being wrong, because that's more than a pound of salt. Editors and readers do not tolerate sloppiness when it comes to names and facts. Misspelling names is usually the result of carelessness, and it angers two sets of people: the people you're trying to name and the people who are inadvertently named. In fact, getting names wrong can lead to getting sued if you identify the wrong person, and we don't want that.
Most of the exercises we do for this course will have information in them that is purposely wrong. You'll notice things like names being spelled multiple ways in the same story and things like that. One of the most important things you want to do when doing stories for this course is to get in the habit of looking things up. And for most of those things, we'll find them in the city directory in the back of the book.
You're going to get to know the city directory very well during this course. Basically, the way the exercises in this textbook work are they've made up a community and they have the names of people, everyone's addresses, etc. And the thing is, they're not always right in the exercises. You're going to have to look up the names and the addresses so we make sure we get them right in the stories. In fact, getting names and addresses incorrect is probably the biggest way people fail stories in this class. The biggest rule is if there's ever any discrepancy between what's in an exercise and what's in the city directory is always right. And it lists city officials, county officials, judges, and community residents who are 18 years of age or older. Here are a couple of sample city directory entries. They list the names last name first, then they list the occupation, then there'll be an R or an H indicating whether they're a renter or a homeowner, then it will list their address. For the first sample entry, our person is Betsy Aaron. She's retired, she's a renter, and she lives at 410 Hillcrest Street, apartment 302. For our second sample entry, we have a couple, George and Lydia Adcock. They're homeowners, and they live at 141 North Cortez Avenue. It lists the occupations in the same order that lists the names. So in this case, George is the manager of the Black Hawk Hotel, and Lydia is a social worker with Catholic Social Services.
If you've heard anything about this class before taking it, it's probably about F errors. Identification of people, businesses, other proper nouns needs to meet professional standards. Also, libel can lead to an F on a paper as well as a major error of fact. The most common error that leads to an F grade on stories is misspelling of names, and that's where the city directory comes in handy. Other common F errors are incorrect addresses, misspelling street and business names, and giving bad information about events. For example, if you're promoting an event and give the wrong time or date, that's going to be an F. The rule of thumb to be keeping in mind is if it's something that would lead to a correction, it's going to be an F. Here are a couple of examples of F errors based on the city directory examples we saw earlier. In the first one on the left, if you called her Betty instead of Betsy, that would be an F because you're getting her name wrong. If you're using her address and you say she's at 401 Hillcrest Street instead of 410, or if you were to call it another street other than Hillcrest, those would be Fs as well. For the example on the right, if you call her Linda instead of Lydia, that would be an F. Getting the name of the hotel wrong if it were to be in a story, or saying that they live on Cortez Avenue with an S rather than a Z, that would also be an F error.
There is no business directory in the book, but sometimes there are ways to look up the names of businesses. For example, if there's a business called Deacosti's Restaurant, there's a pretty good chance that there's someone named Deacosti in the directory. Also, if we have a story where there's an employee of a business, if we look up that employee's name, it will say where they work, and that will give you the correct spelling of the business name. Also, you want to note the city directories for information, not for style, so you want to consult the AP Style book for style of addresses.